For over 30 years, Linda believed she was living the perfect marriage as the loyal wife of a respected Jehovah's Witness elder. But one September morning, a tiny heart drawn on a piece of paper exposed a secret that shattered decades of devotion. What her husband was hiding was darker than she ever imagined. The morning light filtered through the kitchen curtains as I prepared Robert's coffee, the same routine I'd followed for over 30 years. My name is Linda, and at 62, I thought I knew everything there was to know about my life as a devoted Jehovah's Witness. The familiar sound of the coffee pot bubbling should have been comforting, but something felt different that Tuesday morning in September. Maybe it was the way Robert had been avoiding my eyes lately, or how he'd started taking his phone calls in the garden. Or perhaps it was simply the weight of all those years of unquestioned obedience finally settling on my shoulders like dust on an old book. I lived in a modest, two-story house on Maple Street, in a quiet neighborhood where most of the families knew each other from decades of shared morning jogs and borrowed sugar. Robert and I had moved here in the early days of our marriage, when he was just a ministerial servant full of ambition, and I was the eager young wife who believed that submission was the highest form of love. The house still smelled like the vanilla candles I'd been buying from the same catalog for 20 years, and the kitchen walls were adorned with scriptures calligraphed in careful cursive, reminders of what we were supposed to be. "Coffee's ready," I called toward the stairs, though I knew Robert had already left for his early morning meeting with the other elders. These days, there seemed to be more meetings than usual, more whispered conversations that stopped when I entered the room, more reasons for him to be anywhere but home. I poured myself a cup and sat at the kitchen table, the same spot where we used to study together every Tuesday evening, back when we still looked at each other when we talked. The Kingdom Hall was only a 15-minute walk from our house, close enough that we could hear the hymns on summer evenings when the windows were open. I had been attending meetings 3 times a week for 35 years, had knocked on thousands of doors, had studied with dozens of interested ones, and had never once questioned whether the path I was walking was truly mine to choose. That morning, as I sat with my coffee growing cold, I wondered when I had stopped being Linda the person and had become simply Sister Robert, the elder's wife. Robert was respected throughout the circuit, known for his thorough preparation and gentle demeanor with the congregation. When he gave talks from the platform, I would sit in the 3rd row from the front, always on the right side, and feel a flush of pride at being married to such a spiritual man. "He's a blessing to this congregation," the other sisters would tell me, and I would nod and agree, because that's what elders' wives did. We supported, we agreed, we never complained. But lately, during those long meetings that seemed to stretch endlessly under the fluorescent lights, I found myself watching Robert differently. The way he would glance toward the 2nd row where Susan Matthews always sat, perfectly groomed in her pale blue dress with the modest neckline that somehow still managed to draw attention. Susan was a pioneer, unmarried at 55, devoted to the ministry with the kind of enthusiasm that made the rest of us feel spiritually inadequate. She always smelled like white gardenias and spoke in a soft voice that made everyone lean in closer to hear her comments during the Watchtower study. "Linda, could you pass the butter?" Robert had asked during breakfast the previous Sunday, but his eyes were focused somewhere beyond my shoulder, somewhere distant and unreachable. I had passed him the butter and noticed that his hand trembled slightly as he took it. When I asked if he was feeling well, he assured me it was just fatigue from all his responsibilities in the congregation. "The brothers depend on me," he said, and I nodded because I understood the burden of spiritual responsibility, or at least I thought I did. That Tuesday morning, as I cleared away Robert's untouched breakfast, I noticed he had forgotten his briefcase, the brown leather case he carried to every elder meeting, stuffed with Watchtower publications and notes written in his careful handwriting. I picked it up to take it to him and felt how unusually light it was. When I opened it, just to make sure he had everything he needed, I told myself, I found only a single piece of paper with Susan's phone number written in Robert's handwriting, followed by the words, "after 2 p.m., and a small heart drawn in pencil. My hands began to shake as I stared at that innocent-looking piece of paper. A heart. Robert hadn't drawn me a heart in 20 years. I closed the briefcase and set it back down on the table, but the image of that little symbol burned in my mind like a brand. This was the moment. though I didn't know it then, when my perfectly ordered world began to crack along fault lines I hadn't even known existed. If you've ever been part of a religious community where everyone knows everyone else's business, you'll understand how quickly whispers can travel and how dangerous secrets can become. I'd like to invite you to stay with me as I share this story, because sometimes the most important journeys are the ones that force us to question everything we thought we knew about love, faith, and what it really means to be free. Please consider subscribing to hear more stories like this one, because I believe there's healing in knowing we're not alone in our struggles. The phone rang just after 10 o'clock, startling me from my thoughts. When I answered, I heard Susan's voice for the first time in what felt like years of silent Sunday mornings. "Oh, Linda," she said, and I could hear something different in her tone, something that made my stomach tighten. "I was looking for Robert. Is he available?" "He's at a meeting," I replied, my voice sounding strangely calm, even as my heart hammered against my ribs. "Can I take a message?" There was a pause that lasted just a heartbeat too long. "Just tell him Susan called. He'll know what it's about." After she hung up, I stood in my kitchen holding the phone, surrounded by the familiar objects of my orderly life, and realized that something precious and terrible was about to begin. My transformation from the trusting wife to the woman who would eventually question everything began long before that September morning with Susan's phone call. To understand how deeply that simple heart symbol shattered my world, you need to know who I was and who I thought Robert was. I was born Linda Catherine Morrison in 1963, the youngest daughter of a Methodist family in Ohio. My childhood was filled with church socials and Sunday school, but it wasn't until I met Robert at a Kingdom Hall in Columbus during the autumn of 1985 that I truly believed I had found my spiritual home. Robert was 28 then, already a ministerial servant with clear brown eyes and a way of explaining Bible prophecies that made complex doctrines seem beautifully simple. He wore his dark hair neatly parted and always carried a leather-bound Bible with notes tucked between the pages. "Would you like to study the Bible with me?" he had asked after my third meeting. And I remember thinking that his voice sounded like warmth itself. We began meeting every Thursday evening at the local diner, where he would order black coffee and I would have chamomile tea, and he would show me scripture after scripture proving that we were living in the last days. By Christmas of that year, I was convinced that Jehovah's Witnesses had the truth, and by the following spring, I was baptized in a hotel swimming pool during a circuit assembly. Robert proposed to me on a Tuesday evening in June, right there in our regular booth at the diner, with the same gentle certainty he used when explaining difficult Bible passages. "Linda, I believe Jehovah has brought us together," he said, sliding a simple gold band across the Formica table. "Will you help me serve him as my wife?" I said yes without hesitation, because at 24, I was certain that loving God and loving Robert were the same thing. Our wedding was held at the Kingdom Hall, officiated by Robert's mentor, Elder Patterson, a silver-haired man who spoke about headship and submission with the kind of absolute conviction that made questioning seem not just wrong, but impossible. I wore my grandmother's pearl earrings and a modest white dress that covered my shoulders and reached my ankles. Robert looked magnificent in his dark suit, and when Elder Patterson pronounced us husband and wife, I felt like I was stepping into the life I had always been meant to live. The early years were everything I had hoped they would be. Robert advanced quickly in the congregation, first becoming an elder in our 4th year of marriage, then being appointed as the coordinator of the body of elders by our 10th anniversary. I threw myself into the ministry work with the enthusiasm of someone who had finally found her purpose. I became a regular pioneer, spending 70 hours each month knocking on doors and conducting Bible studies with interested women. Our Tuesday evening family study became a model that other couples tried to emulate, and our home was frequently mentioned from the platform as an example of Christian hospitality. "Sister Robert," people began calling me, and I wore that identity like a badge of honor. I organized the Kingdom Hall cleaning schedule, coordinated meals for visiting speakers, and always had my hand raised to comment during the Watchtower study. My comments were brief, supportive, and carefully crafted to show respect for the organization's teachings. I never disagreed with anything published in the literature, never questioned the wisdom of the governing body, and never allowed myself to wonder if there might be other ways to serve God. But if I'm being honest, and after everything that happened, honesty is the only thing I have left. There were small moments over the years when doubt would creep in like cold air under a door. When Sister Martinez was disfellowshipped for asking too many questions about the organization's stance on higher education, I felt a knot in my stomach that I couldn't quite name. When Brother Collins was removed as an elder for suggesting that the door-to-door ministry might not be the most effective way to reach people, I found myself lying awake at night, wondering if asking questions was really the same as lacking faith. Robert seemed untouched by these doubts. He had a way of quoting scripture that ended conversations before they could become uncomfortable. A gentle but firm manner that made people feel foolish for questioning divine wisdom. The organization is Jehovah's channel of communication, he would remind me whenever I shared my concerns. We must trust that he knows what's best for his people. And I would nod and agree, because that's what faithful wives did. Susan Matthews entered our congregation in the spring of 2019, transferred from a hall in Pennsylvania after her elderly mother passed away. She was everything I sometimes feared I wasn't: elegant without being showy, spiritually minded without being self-righteous, and possessed of a quiet confidence that drew people to her like moths to a gentle flame. She had never married, she explained, because she had never found a brother spiritual enough to match her devotion to Jehovah. She's a real asset to our congregation, Robert commented after Susan's first meeting, and I agreed because she clearly was. Susan knew the Bible thoroughly, could recite entire chapters from memory, and always had insightful comments during the ministry school. She began working in service with me regularly, and I enjoyed our conversations about spiritual goals and the joy of seeing people respond to the truth. But somewhere around the beginning of this year, I began noticing small changes in the rhythm of our marriage. Robert would shower and change clothes as soon as he came home from elder meetings, explaining that he wanted to be fresh for our evening Bible study. He started receiving more phone calls in the evenings, always stepping into his study and closing the door. "Just congregation matters," he would say when I asked, and I accepted that explanation because elders carried heavy burdens of confidentiality. Susan, meanwhile, seemed to bloom in ways that made me feel increasingly invisible. She began commenting more frequently during meetings, always sitting in the second row where Robert could see her clearly from the platform. She started wearing a new perfume, something floral and sophisticated that lingered in the air when she passed. During service, she would often ask Robert for advice on challenging return visits, and I would watch them discussing scripture with heads bent close together while I waited by the car. "Robert has been so helpful with my spiritual development," Susan mentioned to me one afternoon as we walked from house to house. "He has such insight into complex Bible prophecies. You're blessed to have such a spiritually mature husband." I thanked her for the compliment, but something in her tone made me feel like she was sharing a secret I wasn't supposed to understand. The man I had married 37 years ago had been predictable in the most comforting way. He read his Bible at the same time every morning, prepared his talks with methodical precision, and never varied from our established routines. But this new version of Robert was restless. He would stand at our bedroom window in the evenings, staring out at nothing I could see. He began staying up late in his study, claiming he was preparing parts for the circuit overseer's visit. When I would bring him tea, I would find him staring at blank paper, his pen untouched beside his hand. "Are you feeling well lately?" I asked him one evening in August, after he had barely touched his dinner for the third time that week. "You seem distracted." He looked at me then with an expression I had never seen before, something that looked almost like guilt mixed with an emotion I couldn't identify. "I'm fine, Linda. Just thinking about congregation matters. There are some situations that require careful prayer and consideration." I believed him, because after 37 years of marriage, the possibility that Robert might be lying to me was as foreign as the idea that the sun might rise in the west. Elders' wives were taught to trust their husbands' spiritual discernment, to support their decisions even when we didn't understand them fully. Questioning your husband's integrity was like questioning Jehovah himself. But that Tuesday morning, holding his briefcase and staring at Susan's phone number with that small, perfect heart, I realized that the Robert I thought I knew might have been as much an illusion as the perfect life I thought we had built together. The days following my discovery of that heart-shaped betrayal unfolded like a slow-motion nightmare, where everything familiar became strange and every certainty crumbled into dust. I began to notice things I had been blind to for months. The way Robert's face would light up when Susan entered the Kingdom Hall, how he would position himself to have a clear view of her during meetings, the frequency with which he found reasons to visit her after the service meetings ended. I started keeping mental notes, not because I wanted to build a case against my husband, but because I desperately needed to understand whether I was losing my mind or discovering a truth that had been hiding in plain sight all along. Tuesday. Robert received 3 phone calls between 7 and 9 p.m., each time excusing himself to his study and speaking in hushed tones. Wednesday. He forgot to eat the lunch I had packed for him, claiming he had been too busy with shepherding calls to remember. Thursday. I found unfamiliar receipts in his jacket pocket, coffee shop purchases made at times when he was supposedly in field service. The woman I had been just weeks earlier would have dismissed these inconsistencies as the natural result of increased spiritual responsibilities. Elders' wives were conditioned to accept that we couldn't understand the full scope of our husbands' duties, that asking too many questions showed a lack of faith in theocratic order. But the woman I was becoming, the one who had seen that heart drawn in Robert's careful handwriting, could no longer ignore what was happening in front of her. "Linda, you seem distracted lately," Sister Johnson mentioned to me after the Thursday evening meeting, her voice carrying the particular tone of concern that women in our congregation used when they sensed gossip-worthy information. "Is everything all right at home?" I assured her that everything was fine, that I was simply dealing with some personal health matters, but I could see the skepticism in her eyes. In a community where everyone monitored everyone else's spiritual temperature, my emotional distance was as noticeable as a fever. Friday afternoon brought what I now think of as the second revelation. I was organizing Robert's home office, a monthly ritual I had maintained for years, when I discovered a small appointment calendar hidden beneath a stack of Watchtower magazines. The entries were sparse but telling. 2:30 p.m. appeared repeatedly over the past 6 weeks, always on days when Robert claimed to have been making shepherding visits. Coffee with S was noted for the previous Tuesday, the same day he had told me he was counseling a troubled brother. My hands trembled as I photographed each page with my phone, though I wasn't sure why I felt compelled to document this evidence. Perhaps it was the researcher in me. Even before becoming a witness, I had been the kind of person who needed to understand things completely before taking action. Or perhaps it was simply the survival instinct of a woman who had spent decades learning not to trust her own perceptions. That evening, Robert seemed different. Not guilty, exactly, but energized in a way I hadn't seen in years. He hummed while shaving, smiled at private thoughts during dinner, and even suggested we take a walk through the neighborhood after the sun set. "It's such a beautiful evening," he said, taking my hand as we stepped onto the sidewalk. "I feel blessed to have such a peaceful life with you." The irony of his words was so sharp it almost made me laugh, but I managed to smile and agree that we were indeed blessed. As we walked past the Morton's house with its carefully maintained garden, past the street lamp where teenagers from the neighborhood used to gather before curfew called them home, I tried to remember the last time Robert and I had taken an evening walk just for the pleasure of each other's company. It must have been years ago, back when we still shared dreams about traveling to Bethel together or serving where the need was greater in some exotic foreign assignment. Now, walking beside him in the gathering dusk, I felt like I was strolling with a stranger who happened to know all the same people I knew. "I've been thinking about our spiritual goals," Robert said as we paused beneath the old oak tree at the corner of Maple and 3rd Street. "Perhaps it's time for us to consider whether we're truly making the best use of our remaining years in this system." His words sounded rehearsed, as if he had practiced this conversation in his mind, and I wondered if he was testing the waters for some larger confession or simply trying to distract me from whatever instincts had been making me more observant lately. "What kind of changes are you thinking about?" I asked, though part of me dreaded his answer. In our community, spiritual goals could mean anything from increased ministry activity to geographic relocation, and all of it would be presented as divine guidance that a submissive wife was expected to embrace without question. "I'm not sure yet," he replied, but there was something in his tone that suggested he was more sure than he was willing to admit. "I've been praying for direction, asking Jehovah to show us what he wants from us in this stage of our lives." He squeezed my hand as he spoke, and I felt the familiar callus on his ring finger from years of gripping pens and microphones. The same hands that had once held mine with such certainty and had recently written Susan's phone number with a heart beside it. The weekend brought our circuit assembly, one of those twice-yearly gatherings where congregations from across the region would come together for intensive spiritual instruction. Robert and I had attended dozens of these assemblies over the years, and they had always felt like spiritual refreshment, a chance to reconnect with old friends, to hear inspiring experiences from the platform, to recommit ourselves to our ministry work. But this assembly felt different from the moment we walked into the convention center that Saturday morning. Susan was there, of course, looking radiant in a navy blue dress that brought out the color of her eyes. She had saved seats for herself in the section reserved for our congregation, and I noticed that she had chosen spots with a clear view of the area where Robert would be sitting with the other elders during the special meetings. When she waved at us across the crowded auditorium, Robert's face lit up with the kind of smile I hadn't seen him give me in months. "Isn't Sister Matthews looking well?" Robert commented as we found our seats, and I agreed because she was indeed looking well. Better than well, actually. There was a glow about her that reminded me of how I had looked in the early days of my own courtship with Robert, when the future seemed full of infinite possibility, and every day brought new reasons to feel grateful for being alive. During the lunch break, I watched from across the cafeteria as Robert and Susan stood together near the literature counter, their conversation animated in a way that made other people glance in their direction. They weren't doing anything obviously inappropriate, maintaining the proper distance, keeping their voices low, behaving exactly as a spiritual elder and a devoted pioneer should behave in public. But there was an electricity between them that was unmistakable to anyone who had ever been in love. "They make a good team, don't they?" Sister Williams observed, following my gaze. "Brother Robert has been such a help to Sister Matthews as she adjusts to our congregation. It's wonderful to see how the brothers care for the sisters who are alone." Her words were innocent enough, but something in her expression suggested she had noticed the same undercurrent I was seeing. That evening, as Robert and I drove home from the assembly in comfortable silence, I found myself studying his profile in the intermittent light from passing street lamps. This was the face I had woken up next to for over 3 decades, the man whose breathing had lulled me to sleep through years of shared dreams and accumulated memories. When had I stopped really seeing him? When had he become so adept at hiding his true thoughts from me? The program was especially good today, I ventured, testing whether he might voluntarily mention Susan or any of their interactions. Brother Henderson's experience about finding spiritual strength during his wife's illness was very moving. "Yes, it was," Robert agreed, but I could tell his mind was elsewhere. "It reminded me of how important it is to appreciate the people Jehovah has placed in our lives while we still have time with them." Again, his words felt rehearsed, as if he were following a script I wasn't supposed to recognize. Sunday morning brought the continuation of the assembly, but also brought the incident that would change everything. During the final session, while the circuit overseer was giving his concluding talk about maintaining spiritual vigilance in the last days, I noticed Susan quietly leaving her seat and heading toward the restroom area. A few minutes later, Robert excused himself from the elders section, claiming he needed to check on some arrangement for the closing song. Something compelled me to follow them, though I told myself I was simply going to use the restroom myself. What I discovered instead was Robert and Susan standing together in the corridor outside the convention center's administrative offices, their bodies closer than any spiritual discussion would require. I couldn't hear their words, but I could see Susan's hand resting briefly on Robert's arm, could see the way he leaned toward her as if drawn by an invisible force. They didn't see me standing frozen in the doorway that led back to the main auditorium, didn't notice me retreating on trembling legs to my seat, where I sat for the remaining 30 minutes of the program in a state of numb shock. When Robert returned to the elders section, his face was flushed and his hair slightly mussed, as if he had been running his hands through it. When Susan slipped back into her seat 15 minutes later, she looked serene and satisfied in a way that made my stomach clench with a mixture of rage and heartbreak. The drive home that afternoon was excruciating. Robert hummed quietly while he drove, occasionally commenting on the beauty of the autumn foliage or the spiritual richness of the program we had just attended. I responded with appropriate murmurs of agreement, but inside I felt like I was fracturing into 1,000 pieces. The man sitting beside me, the one who had promised before God and our entire congregation to forsake all others, was in love with another woman and apparently had been for some time. "Linda, you've been very quiet today," he observed as we turned onto our street. "Are you feeling well? You look pale." "Just tired," I managed to say, though tired was perhaps the most inadequate word ever used to describe the complete emotional devastation I was experiencing. "It's been a long weekend. Perhaps you should rest when we get home," he suggested, and I wondered if his concern was genuine or if he was simply hoping to have some private time to call Susan and relive whatever had happened between them in that corridor. "I have some preparation to do for next week's service meeting anyway." That Sunday evening, as I sat in our living room pretending to read the latest Watchtower while Robert worked in his study, I made a decision that would have seemed impossible to me just weeks earlier. I was going to confront this situation directly, not as the submissive elder's wife I had been trained to be, but as a woman who deserved to know the truth about her own life. I didn't know yet what that confrontation would look like or what consequences it might bring, but I knew that I could no longer pretend not to see what was happening right in front of me. The sound of Robert's phone ringing in his study, followed by his quick footsteps to answer it and the immediate lowering of his voice to a whisper, only confirmed what I already knew. Tomorrow, I decided, everything would change. Tomorrow, I would stop being afraid of what I might discover and start demanding the truth I had been denied for far too long. Monday morning arrived with the kind of crisp October clarity that made everything seem sharper, more defined, as if the universe itself was preparing for revelation. I had barely slept, spending most of the night rehearsing what I would say to Robert, how I would present the evidence I had been gathering, what questions I would ask. But when I walked into the kitchen at 6:30 and found him already dressed and preparing to leave for an early meeting, all my careful preparation evaporated. "You're leaving early today," I observed, pouring coffee into the travel mug he used for rushed mornings. My voice sounded remarkably steady considering that my heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. "Circuit Overseer visit preparation," he explained, accepting the coffee without quite meeting my eyes. "We elders need to review all the congregation records before Brother Martinez arrives next week." The lie rolled off his tongue with the practiced ease of someone who had been refining his deceptions for months, and I felt something cold and final settle in my chest. "Robert," I said, and the tone of my voice made him pause with his hand on the kitchen door. "We need to talk when you get home tonight. There are some things we need to discuss." For just a moment, I saw something flicker across his face, fear perhaps, or recognition that his carefully constructed double life was about to collapse. But then the expression was gone, replaced by the gentle, concerned demeanor he had perfected over decades of shepherding troubled congregants. "Of course, Linda. Is everything all right? You've seemed troubled lately." His ability to show concern for my well-being while actively betraying me was so breathtaking in its audacity that I almost laughed out loud. "We'll talk tonight," I repeated, and this time there was no mistaking the steel in my voice. Robert nodded slowly and left for his meeting, but not before I saw his hand tremble slightly as he reached for the door handle. I spent the day in a state of strange, crystalline calm. I cleaned the house with methodical precision, organized my thoughts into coherent arguments, and prepared myself for what I knew would be one of the most difficult conversations of my life. At 3 o'clock, Susan called, not for Robert this time, but for me. "Linda, I hope you don't mind me calling," she began, and there was something different in her voice, something that sounded almost like guilt. "I wanted to thank you for being so welcoming since I joined the congregation. Your friendship has meant a great deal to me during this transition period." The irony of receiving gratitude from the woman who was destroying my marriage was so sharp it took my breath away. "Susan," I said carefully, "I think we should have a conversation soon. There are some things that need to be discussed openly." There was a long pause before she replied, "Perhaps that would be beneficial. When would be convenient for you?" "Today," I said without hesitation. "Can you come over this afternoon, before Robert returns from his meetings?" Yes. I suppose that would be possible. Around 4 o'clock? After she hung up, I sat in my living room surrounded by the artifacts of 37 years of marriage. Wedding photos, commendation letters from the circuit overseer, framed scriptures that spoke of love and faithfulness, and waited for the woman who had been sharing secret moments with my husband to walk through my front door. Susan arrived precisely at 4 o'clock, carrying a small bouquet of white chrysanthemums, as if this were a social visit rather than the confrontation we both knew it would be. She looked beautiful but nervous, her usual composure slightly fractured around the edges. "Thank you for agreeing to see me," she said, as I led her into the living room where we had hosted so many Bible studies and congregation gatherings over the years. "I brought these from my garden. I thought you might enjoy them." I accepted the flowers and set them on the coffee table between us, their innocent beauty a stark contrast to the darkness we were about to navigate together. "Susan, I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I would appreciate a direct answer. Are you in love with my husband?" The question hung in the air between us like a sword waiting to fall. Susan's face went pale, then flushed deep red, and I watched her struggle between the trained response of denial and what appeared to be a genuine desire to stop living with the burden of deception. "Linda," she began, then stopped, pressing her hands together in her lap as if she were praying. "I never meant for this to happen. When I moved here, I was simply looking for a congregation where I could serve Jehovah faithfully. But Robert, he's such a spiritual man, so kind and understanding. When I was struggling with loneliness, he was there to listen. When I had questions about my service to God, he had wisdom to share." "That doesn't answer my question," I said quietly. "Are you in love with him?" She looked directly at me then, and I saw tears forming in her eyes. "Yes," she whispered. "God help me. Yes, I am. And I believe he feels the same way about me." The words I had been expecting still hit me like a physical blow. Hearing the truth spoken aloud was different from suspecting it, different from discovering evidence of it. This was the moment when my marriage officially ended, even though Robert wasn't even in the room. "How long?" I asked, surprised by how calm my voice remained. "The feelings began developing around Easter," she admitted, tears now flowing freely down her cheeks. "But we didn't act on them until recently. Linda, I know how terrible this must be for you. I know I violated everything we claim to believe about Christian conduct. But sometimes feelings develop that are stronger than our ability to control them." "And what about my feelings?" I asked, standing up and walking to the window where I could see our neighbors going about their ordinary Monday afternoon routines. "What about the 37 years I've invested in this marriage? What about the vows Robert made before God and our entire congregation?" "I know," Susan said behind me, her voice breaking. "I know how selfish and destructive this has been. But Linda, your marriage, it hasn't been truly alive for years. Robert has told me how lonely he's been, how disconnected you two have become. Perhaps this is Jehovah's way of showing both of you that it's time for a change." I turned around to face her, and Susan actually recoiled at whatever expression she saw on my face. "Don't you dare," I said, my voice low and dangerous. "Don't you dare try to make God responsible for your adultery. Don't you dare suggest that my marriage was somehow inadequate enough to justify what you've done." "You're right," she said quickly, wiping her eyes with a tissue from her purse. "You're absolutely right. There's no justification for what we've done. But Linda, what happens now? Do you plan to tell the elders? Will you expose this to the congregation?" The question revealed the heart of what this was really about. Not spiritual guilt or genuine remorse, but fear of the consequences that would follow public exposure of their affair. In our community, adultery wasn't just a personal failing. It was a judicial matter that would result in disfellowshipping, shunning, and the complete destruction of their reputations within the only social structure either of them had ever known. "I don't know yet," I answered honestly. "I haven't decided what I'm going to do with this information." Susan nodded slowly, perhaps recognizing that her fate now rested in the hands of the woman she had wronged so profoundly. "I should go," she said, gathering her purse and jacket. "Robert will be home soon, and I think you two need to have your conversation privately." After she left, I sat alone in my living room, holding those white chrysanthemums and trying to process what had just happened. The woman who had been destroying my marriage had just walked through my front door, admitted her guilt, and then walked out again, leaving me to decide not just my own future, but theirs as well. The power of that position should have felt satisfying, but instead it felt like a burden I wasn't sure I wanted to carry. Robert came home at 6:15, earlier than usual, as if he sensed that something significant was about to happen. He found me still sitting in the living room, still holding Susan's flowers, and the expression on his face told me that he knew our reckoning had finally arrived. "Linda," he said softly, not moving from the doorway. "We need to talk, don't we?" "Yes, Robert, we do." Robert closed the front door behind him with the careful precision of a man who understood that this moment would divide his life into before and after. He hung his jacket on the coat rack with the same methodical attention he brought to preparing his platform presentations, but his hands were shaking and we both pretended not to notice. "Would you like some coffee?" I asked, because even in moments of complete marital collapse, the habits of hospitality die hard. "Or perhaps you'd prefer to sit down first." "I think I should sit down," he said, choosing the armchair across from the sofa where I had been waiting for him. The same chair where he had delivered countless family Bible studies, where he had counseled troubled congregation members, where he had once held our infant nephew while discussing the joys of spiritual parenthood with visiting relatives. Now it would be the chair where he confessed to adultery. "Susan was here this afternoon," I began, placing the white chrysanthemums on the coffee table between us like evidence in a trial neither of us wanted to attend. "We had a very illuminating conversation." Robert's face went pale, then flushed, then pale again, as if his body couldn't decide which physiological response was appropriate for this level of emotional catastrophe. "Linda, she loves you," I interrupted, my voice steady despite the tremor I felt in my chest. "And she believes you love her too. Is she correct in that belief?" The silence that followed stretched between us like a chasm that had been years in the making. Robert stared at his hands, clasped tightly in his lap, and I could see him struggling with the same decision Susan had faced earlier, whether to continue the deception or finally release himself from the burden of lying to the person he had once promised to cherish above all others. "Yes," he whispered, the single syllable barely audible in our suddenly enormous living room. "God forgive me. Yes." Hearing him admit it aloud was different from Susan's confession. When she had spoken of her love for my husband, it had felt like an attack from outside our marriage. But Robert's admission came from within the sacred space we had built together, and it felt like watching the foundation of our entire shared life crack and crumble. "How long have you been lying to me?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I actually wanted to know the answer. "The feelings, they began developing in the spring," Robert said, finally looking up to meet my eyes. "I tried to fight them, Linda. I prayed, I studied, I threw myself into congregation responsibilities, hoping the feelings would fade, but they only grew stronger." "And when did you decide to act on those feelings?" The question came out harsher than I had intended, but I was discovering that betrayed wives have less control over their tone than they might wish. Robert winced as if I had struck him physically. We first spoke privately about our feelings in August, during the circuit overseer's visit. We had been assigned to work together on hospitality arrangements, and we found ourselves alone in the Kingdom Hall kitchen after everyone else had left. I remembered that evening clearly now, how Robert had come home later than expected, how he had seemed energized and distracted, how he had suggested we take a walk through the neighborhood as if he needed to burn off excess emotional energy. And then, we began meeting occasionally for coffee, just to talk, initially. We told ourselves we were discussing spiritual matters, helping each other grow closer to Jehovah. The practiced self-deception in his voice was almost as painful as the adultery itself. But we both knew what was really happening. "Where did you meet?" I asked, though I wasn't sure why the logistics mattered to me. Perhaps I needed to understand the complete architecture of his deception, to map out all the lies that had been supporting our marriage like rotting timbers. "The coffee shop on 5th Street usually. Sometimes the park near the library. Places where we thought we wouldn't encounter anyone from the congregation." He paused, running his hands through his hair in a gesture I had seen him make thousands of times during our marriage, but which now seemed to belong to a stranger. "Linda, I know how terrible this sounds, how completely I've betrayed your trust and violated everything we claim to believe about Christian marriage." "Yes, you have," I agreed, and the simple acknowledgement seemed to deflate something in him. But I need to understand more than just the physical aspects of your betrayal, Robert. I need to understand how you justified this to yourself. How did a man who gives talks about spiritual headship and Christian integrity convince himself that adultery was acceptable? The question hung in the air between us, and I could see Robert struggling with it as much as I was. This was the heart of what I couldn't comprehend. Not just that he had fallen in love with another woman, but that he had managed to continue functioning as an elder, continue giving spiritual counsel to others, continue representing himself as a model of Christian behavior while living a complete lie. I told myself that my feelings for Susan were different from what I felt for you. He said finally, his voice so quiet I had to lean forward to hear him. I convinced myself that what Susan and I shared was more spiritual, more pure somehow, that we understood each other in ways that transcended physical attraction. And what about our marriage? I asked. What did you tell yourself about me? Robert looked directly at me then, and I saw something in his eyes that might have been genuine remorse, or might simply have been fear of the consequences he was about to face. I told myself that our marriage had become routine, comfortable, but not passionate, that we had grown into spiritual companions, but had lost the deeper connection that makes a marriage truly alive. The cruelty of his words was breathtaking, not because they were entirely untrue, but because they revealed how little effort he had made to address whatever problems he perceived in our relationship. Instead of talking to me about feeling disconnected, instead of suggesting counseling or working together to rediscover intimacy, he had simply found someone else to fill whatever void he felt in his life. So you decided that rather than working on our marriage, you would replace me, I said. And Robert flinched again at the bluntness of my statement. It wasn't that simple, Linda. It wasn't a conscious decision to replace you. It felt like I had found someone who understood parts of me that had been dormant for years. Someone who shared my deepest spiritual concerns and aspirations. Your deepest spiritual concerns, I repeated, unable to keep the bitterness out of my voice. Is that what you call adultery now? A spiritual concern? You have every right to be angry, Robert said, and I wanted to laugh at the inadequacy of his response. Angry didn't begin to cover the complex mixture of rage, heartbreak, humiliation, and betrayal that was coursing through my system like poison. Robert, I need you to understand something, I said, standing up and walking to the mantelpiece where our wedding photo sat next to a framed scripture about love never failing. This isn't just about your feelings for Susan, or even about the lies you've been telling me. This is about the complete destruction of everything I thought I knew about my own life. I picked up our wedding photo and studied it for a moment. Two young people who had been so certain about their future together, so confident that their shared faith would carry them through any difficulty. For 37 years, I have built my entire identity around being your wife, being an elder's wife, being part of this organization that claims to represent divine truth. And now I discover that the foundation of all of that, my marriage to you, has been a lie for months. Robert started to speak, but I held up my hand to stop him. I'm not finished. Do you have any idea what it feels like to realize that while I was defending you to people who were gossiping about your behavior, while I was making excuses for your distraction and your absences, while I was lying in bed next to you every night believing we were partners in this life, do you have any idea what it feels like to realize that during all of that time, you were planning your future with someone else? Linda, I never planned to leave you, Robert said, but even as the words left his mouth, I could see that he realized how hollow they sounded. Then what exactly were you planning, Robert? Did you think you could continue this affair indefinitely? Did you think Susan would be content to remain your secret spiritual companion forever? Did you imagine that I would never notice that my husband had emotionally divorced me? The question seemed to overwhelm him, and he put his face in his hands like a child who wished he could make himself disappear. I don't know, he said through his fingers. I know that sounds impossible to believe, but I honestly don't know what I thought would happen. I was living day to day, meeting to meeting, just trying to find reasons to see her while maintaining some semblance of normal life with you. And what about the congregation? I asked. What about all the people who look up to you as their spiritual shepherd? What about the families you've counseled about the importance of marriage fidelity? What about the judicial committees where you've sat in judgment of people guilty of the same sins you've been committing? This question, seemed to hit Robert harder than anything else I had said. His shoulders sagged, as if the weight of his hypocrisy was finally too much to bear. "I know," he said. "I know how wrong it all is. I know I've violated everything I've taught and believed for decades. But Linda, I also know that what I feel for Susan is real, and I don't know how to make those feelings disappear." "You're not supposed to make them disappear, Robert. You're supposed to choose not to act on them. That's what commitment means. That's what marriage vows mean. That's what being an adult means." I was surprising myself with the steadiness of my voice, the clarity of my thoughts. For months I had been drowning in confusion and self-doubt, but now that the truth was finally in the open, I felt stronger than I had in years. "You're right," Robert said simply. "You're absolutely right about everything. I have no defense for what I've done, no justification that makes any of this acceptable. The only question now is what happens next." We sat in silence for several minutes, both of us contemplating a future that neither of us had planned for or wanted. Finally, Robert spoke again. "What are you going to do, Linda? Are you going to report this to the elders? Are you going to ask me to leave?" The questions forced me to confront decisions I hadn't fully prepared myself to make. In our religious community, adultery wasn't just grounds for divorce. It was a disfellowshipping offense that would result in Robert's complete removal from all the positions and relationships that had defined his adult life. And as his wife, I would be expected to either work toward reconciliation or formally end the marriage, with the entire congregation watching and judging every choice I made. "I don't know yet," I answered honestly. "I need time to think about what I want my life to look like going forward. But Robert, I need you to understand that regardless of what I decide to do officially, our marriage is over. Whatever trust and love we once shared has been destroyed by months of deliberate deception." Robert nodded slowly, and for the first time since he had walked through the door, he looked like he truly understood the magnitude of what he had lost. "I know," he said, "and I'm sorry, Linda. I know that's inadequate, but I am genuinely sorry for the pain I've caused you." As I looked at this man I had shared my life with for nearly 4 decades, I felt something shift inside me. Not forgiveness exactly, but a kind of resigned clarity about what needed to happen next. The marriage was over, but my life was not. And perhaps, for the first time in years, that life might actually belong to me. 6 months have passed since that October evening, when my marriage officially ended in our living room among Susan's white chrysanthemums and 37 years of accumulated memories. As I sit here writing this story, I can hear the morning birds singing outside my new apartment window, and the sound fills me with a peace I hadn't realized was possible for someone like me to experience. The immediate aftermath of Robert's confession was every bit as difficult as I had anticipated. I spent 3 sleepless nights deciding whether to report his adultery to the body of elders, knowing that such a report would trigger a judicial committee that could result in his disfellowshipping. In the end, I chose a different path, one that surprised everyone, including myself. On Thursday morning, I called Robert into the living room where we had shared our final honest conversation and told him my decision. "I want you to confess voluntarily to the elders," I said, watching his face carefully. "I want you to take responsibility for what you've done without forcing me to become your accuser." His relief was palpable, though we both knew that voluntary confession wouldn't necessarily lead to a more lenient outcome. "Thank you," he said quietly. "That's more grace than I deserve from you." "It's not grace, Robert. It's practicality. I don't want to spend the rest of my life defined by what you did to our marriage. I want to move forward without carrying the weight of being the woman who destroyed an elder's reputation." That same afternoon, Robert met with the coordinator of the body of elders and confessed to his months-long emotional and physical affair with Susan. The judicial committee was scheduled for the following week, and the congregation buzzed with whispered speculation about why such a respected elder would suddenly need to appear before his fellow shepherds. The committee's decision was swift and decisive. Both Robert and Susan were disfellowshipped, effective immediately. Their names were announced from the platform the following Thursday evening. And just like that, 2 people who had been pillars of spiritual strength in our community became non-persons, invisible to everyone they had once called brother and sister. I attended that Thursday evening meeting, sitting in my usual spot in the third row, and listened as the announcement was made with the clinical detachment that our organization used for such proceedings. Robert Morrison and Susan Matthews are no longer Jehovah's Witnesses, the presiding overseer stated, offering no explanation beyond the standard warning that the congregation should have no contact with them going forward. The aftermath was predictably complicated. Some congregation members treated me with the careful sympathy reserved for innocent victims of spiritual catastrophe, while others seemed to view me with suspicion, as if Robert's fall from grace must somehow reflect poorly on my fitness as a Christian wife. The worst were those who offered unsolicited advice about forgiveness and reconciliation, suggesting that a truly spiritual woman would work to restore her marriage rather than allowing it to end. "Sister Morrison," Elder Peterson approached me after a meeting in November, his voice carrying the particular tone of authority that elders used when dispensing counsel. "I hope you're praying seriously about whether Jehovah might want you to work toward reconciling with Robert when his period of discipline ends. After all, marriage is a sacred arrangement." I looked at this man who had known me for over 2 decades, who had watched me serve faithfully in dozens of different capacities, and realized that he genuinely believed my primary obligation was still to the man who had betrayed me so completely. "Elder Peterson," I replied with a calmness that surprised us both, "I believe Jehovah wants me to make decisions based on wisdom and self-respect, not just on institutional expectations about what makes a good wife." His discomfort with my response was obvious, but I no longer felt compelled to manage other people's comfort with my choices. That conversation was one of many that helped me understand how thoroughly the organization's expectations had shaped not just my marriage, but my entire sense of what I owed to other people versus what I owed to myself. By December, I had made the decision that felt inevitable from the moment Robert first admitted his adultery. I filed for divorce. The legal proceedings were straightforward since Robert didn't contest anything, but the emotional process of untangling 4 decades of shared life was exhausting and sometimes heartbreaking. Dividing our possessions felt like dissecting the corpse of our former happiness. The books we had studied together, the photographs from circuit assemblies and family gatherings, the furniture we had chosen with such care in the early years of our marriage, everything carried the weight of memories that were no longer purely joyful. I kept the practical items I needed for independent living and let Robert take most of the sentimental objects. Not out of generosity, but because I discovered I no longer wanted to be surrounded by reminders of the life I had lost. The hardest part wasn't the anger or the heartbreak. It was learning how to make decisions as Linda Morrison rather than as Sister Robert or the elder's wife. For 37 years, my choices had been filtered through the lens of how they would affect Robert's reputation, the congregation's perception of our marriage, and the organization's expectations for Christian women. Suddenly, I was free to consider only what I actually wanted, and the experience was both terrifying and exhilarating. In January, I moved into a small apartment across town, far enough from our old neighborhood to avoid constant reminders, but close enough to maintain some continuity in my daily routines. The apartment has 2 bedrooms, one for sleeping and one that I've turned into a reading room where I keep books that were never permitted in our theocratic library. Philosophy, comparative religion, feminist theology, even novels that explore themes our organization had always discouraged. Reading these books feels like discovering parts of myself that had been dormant for decades. I still attend Kingdom Hall meetings, though less frequently than before, and with a different spirit than I once brought to those gatherings. I participate in the ministry work occasionally, but I no longer feel compelled to maintain the ambitious schedule that had defined my identity as a pioneer. Instead, I've been exploring other ways to serve others, volunteering at a literacy program, helping at a local food bank, activities that allow me to express compassion without the institutional constraints that had always circumscribed my service to God. Some congregation members have distanced themselves from me, either because of lingering association with Robert's disgrace or because my new independence makes them uncomfortable. But others have surprised me with their genuine friendship and support. Sister Johnson, whom I had always considered somewhat superficial, has become one of my closest confidants. "Linda," she told me over coffee last month, Watching you rebuild your life has given me courage to address some problems in my own marriage that I've been ignoring for years. Robert and I have had no contact since the divorce was finalized in March. I heard through congregation gossip that he moved to another state, presumably to start over somewhere his reputation hadn't been destroyed. I genuinely hope he finds peace and genuine repentance, not because I have any interest in reconciling with him, but because carrying guilt and shame indefinitely serves no one's highest good. Susan, I learned from the same gossip network, has also moved away from the area. I feel no animosity toward her anymore, though I can't claim to feel friendship either. She was as much a victim of the organization's unhealthy approach to sexuality and relationships as I was, just in different ways. We were all trying to honor God while suppressing fundamental human needs for authentic intimacy and honest emotional connection. The most surprising aspect of this entire experience has been discovering how much strength I possessed beneath all those years of trained submission. The woman who once asked Robert's permission before rearranging the living room furniture has learned to change her own car oil, negotiate her own lease agreements, and make decisions about everything from financial investments to weekend plans based solely on her own judgment and preferences. I'm not the same person who found that heart drawn beside Susan's phone number in Robert's briefcase. That woman was terrified of her own perceptions, conditioned to doubt her instincts, trained to value peace over truth. This woman, the one writing these words, trusts herself to recognize deception, values her own well-being enough to protect it, and understands that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is to refuse to enable their destructive choices. Last week, I celebrated my 63rd birthday alone in my reading room, surrounded by books I had chosen for myself and thoughts that belonged entirely to me. It wasn't the life I had planned or the future I had imagined during all those years of faithful service and devoted marriage. But it was honest, and it was mine, and those qualities felt more precious to me than all the spiritual accolades I had once pursued. As the sun set that evening, casting long shadows across my new life, I realized that what I had once mistaken for spiritual contentment had often been spiritual complacency. True peace, I now understand, requires the courage to face difficult truths and make painful changes when necessary. It requires choosing growth over comfort, authenticity over approval, and self-respect over the security of familiar patterns. I don't know what the next chapter of my story will look like, but for the first time in decades, that uncertainty feels like possibility rather than fear. This is a true story, shared by one of our subscribers. Thank you very much for trusting us. If you also have a story you'd like to share, write in the comments. We'd be very happy to tell your story on our channel.